Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And first of all, I wanted to ask straight up, are there any Americans in the room? Excellent. All right. So why I say that is I'm actually currently living in the US. And so I do sometimes get a bit of a brain fade travelling around with American terminology. So please jump out of your chair if I say something that sounds really odd. And I'm talking more than cell phone, mobile phone. I'm talking some terminology. So if anything does come up, please raise your hand. And I'd like to, follow on from your words. I think it's fantastic that we've got people here from China. I've spent some time in China talking more about skills and sustainability, not sustainability of vocational education, but sustainability in the green space and how to engage young people in skilled careers. And just a very quick story to start off, I made a fatal mistake. My first trip to China, I was there with the mayor of Dalian, which is a seaport, and I was at a dinner function, and you're polite when you're in another country and you're given some odd food to eat, and there I was eating this sea cucumber, which is really like a tennis ball turned inside out, stuffed with some sort of strange seafood mince creation. And I made the mistake that I said to the mayor, he said, "What do you think? It's a delicacy. You're a former chef." And I said, "It's wonderful. I really like it." I was getting it with room service. I was getting it with breakfast. I got a gift pack to take away, to bring back to Australia. But my time was really interesting in China, and I saw the opportunity. But today I'm here to talk about people without jobs and jobs without people. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is fairly intuitive. And I'm in a room of content experts. And so some of the things I might have to say may be fairly simplistic, but I think that's the way of the future, and that's really where we need to take this conversation. And when I start to talk generally about the types of jobs and the jobs of the future, I am talking with broad, brush strokes, but really today is a conversation. So I'm only going to talk for about 20 minutes, maybe more, maybe a few minutes more. And then I actually wanted to engage with you because I like to write and I like to research. And so I've written a book, and some of you may have received that book yesterday. And this is actually a book that was written for the North American market, but it's actually now being released in Australia in 2016. And for me as an Australian, it really, in some ways, summed up what's going on in Australia. It was more difficult for me to get this book published in Australia, in my own home country, than it actually was in the US. And I'm not sure what that really says about where we are in our in the current space. But it enabled me to travel as a part of a Churchill Fellowship as well through the US, through the UK, through Spain. I spent time with the OECD, spent time with people at Harvard University who've written the Pathways to Prosperity. Does anyone know about that report? The Schwartz? David, wonderful. Yeah, it's a great report, well worth looking at. And really, how I like to approach things is have a conversation. What I'm really talking about here, from my perspective, is how to engage people in skills-based education. And I think a lot of the speakers have talked about their relationship to where we are in Western Sydney, and I'm pleased that my organisation has employed, on average, around 200 apprentices at any one time. And we've been based in George Street in Parramatta for over 10 years. And so I really feel I have a good feel of what's going on the front line, particularly in the apprenticeship space. And the good news is that the number of apprentices in our organisation has grown by about 25% in the last year. So I really feel there is a awakening across the Australian market that a way to compete is in human capital. It's about building a solid labour pipeline. So I think we've really started to come a long way where the conversations like today and like with this conference, talking about how we can actually make sure that our education systems are aligned to the jobs that actually exist. Businesses can't find... Are there any employers in the room? Okay, a couple of employees in the room. I talked Yeah, so probably, not a large number, but in some indirect way, the people that we're working for are most definitely employers. What is going on? How is it possible that we have this labour market mismatch where employers are saying we cannot remain competitive in the Australian environment? We live in this age of globalisation and technological change, and the way that our workplaces, the businesses in Western Sydney, are not competing with other businesses in Western Sydney, or even in larger Greater New South Wales and regional New South Wales, or even in Australia. It's a global marketplace, and I think that with the onset of technological change, some employers, some of the astute employers really realise that to compete, they need to have skills that are competent in a global context. So really, you'd really hear it described as the skills gap. Everyone's heard of the skills gap? Could I just have a quick show of hands? Who believes that the skills gap actually exists? Now that's interesting. So about a third of the room. Gee, I'd love to break this down into one-on-one sessions now and find out why. I think there's enough evidence, whether you call it the skills gap, whether you call it a labour market mismatch. There is no question, if you look at the youth unemployment rates in our country, and particularly in some pockets, and then you look at the jobs that are available, the only other explanation is there's a lazy generation of young Australians who don't want to work. Because why is it that employers can't fill jobs that are available when we have record high youth unemployment, 2 to 3 times the national average, sometimes 4 or 5 times the national average? What are other explanations? And I should clarify that in case anyone wants to run down the aisle and give me a serve. I don't hold young people responsible for the situation we find ourselves in, and sadly there's many young Australians who are able to leave school and go straight onto welfare, and governments have all tried to address this situation. But it's a real problem when we have entry-level wages that actually equate to similar sort of numbers with entry-level positions. And so we get young people who come into our office in Western Sydney and they say, well, my current pay, and you're looking at the person's CV and you're saying, you haven't worked. What are you talking about your pay? They're actually talking about welfare because it's their entitlement. So to really get this country humming, we've got an ageing population, and I don't need to talk about that in great detail. We need to engage the next generation of young Australians. Now the question is, how do we do that? Do we do that through incentives? How do we do that? Is it because, if we look to an industry like IT, I'm spending a lot of time in IT with the IBM company and varying other corporations at the moment. And when you talk to young Australians, they see all the exciting, generally speaking, technology going on in Silicon Valley with Google and all these American companies, and they see all the boring IT jobs are in Australia, coding and things that nobody wants to do. So really it's up to the IT industry to get the message out, well, there are some opportunities and there are some really exciting things going on in the country. Okay, that is actually a photo of me. But that was not me graduating, because I didn't graduate under those circumstances. And that's a representation of my father, but he was an academic at Monash University for his career, and he had ideas about my pathway. He was a psychologist, he was a fairly clever guy, and he had ideas about where he wanted me to go. I had other ideas. And one of the reasons that I had other ideas is that's my school report, and it doesn't perform well on tests, creative and enthusiastic. Somebody did say, yes, Nick, you didn't circle a bit that said frequent absences. Now, the frequent absences were driven purely because the curriculum didn't engage me. I wanted to learn in a different way. Now, my school, they've just realised, what's this, 2015? I was at school a few years ago. They've just started to get into the idea now. It's taken them, 25 years to realise that some of the jobs that they thought their students were going to go into in the pathways, as we heard from Jan last night, legal, accounting, all bets are off. These jobs are changing, and it's how can we train people and how can we engage them. So I had other ideas. So the academic pathway was not the right way for me to travel, and that actually is also a real photo. It's not photoshopped or anything. That was at the Regent Hotel in Melbourne back in the mid-80s. So I went off and left school, and for better or for worse, I left school in year 11, and some people say, my goodness, you couldn't do that these days, and probably my advice is don't leave school at year 11. But for me, it was really, I was going to become detached from education altogether. I couldn't engage with my school, I didn't like the learning style, so I actually attended William Angliss, and that really was how I wanted to learn, at the time. But ultimately, what's it about? Being happy. When people ask me about what career path should my son or daughter, or when young people come into our office and there's an application form and it says, you're here today applying for the electrical apprenticeship, the automotive apprenticeship, the culinary apprenticeship, the business traineeship, and they tick every box. About 50% of people who come through the door to apply for a job with us tick every box. And they say, I'm so confused, there's so much information on the internet, there's so many websites, there's so many apps, I can't tell what information is credible and what's not. I can't tell what companies are actually using search engine optimization to push up material into the internet. So it's a real minefield out there, and I claim to have some expertise, and I find it very complicated. But ultimately, if I'm talking to parents, I say, you know what, just relax. You might have aspirations for your son or daughter, and like my father, it might be a university pathway, but it's about the right education at the right time. So as I stand here in this fine institution, I am saying that my message is most definitely not an anti-do not go to university message whatsoever. But it has to be about the right education for you and the right education at the right time. So I ended up completing my apprenticeship, represented Australia in the Culinary Olympics, and then I did an MBA and a graduate diploma and ended up at Harvard Business School and the Kennedy School of Government. So for me, it's very much about this idea of the right education at the right time, and so many young people that we see come through our door feel this immense parental pressure, and I think that is having a lot to do with this labour market mismatch. I talk about what an apprenticeship is, and I'm sure that most people in the room, this is a slide that I use particularly if I'm talking to people in America and I explain what an apprenticeship is. Because there's that ghastly man, Donald Trump, some of you may have heard of him, who's had some despicable things to say in the last couple of weeks. But I was in Singapore, gave this presentation. I was pretty excited to be in Singapore. I'm dancing around and, I thought I nailed it. First question was from a lady 3 rows in, and I said, yes. And she said, how long have you worked for Donald Trump? And I stood and I just couldn't put it together, and I realised that in Singapore there was this, The Apprentice, the television show, had just been, pretty much running, 5 nights a week. And so there is a lot of confusion about what an apprenticeship is, but that's my definition. You'll see that I've sourced the information from the right place. Reliable and credible information, and I think that we heard from the speakers yesterday, is absolutely critical for people right throughout the market. And whether it's schools, whether it's parents, whether it's educators, we all need to understand what is going on. Now, I think this slide should give a bit of cause for concern for people in our country. And as I travel around and we look to the UK, you'll see that if I put up a slide there to show apprenticeships in the UK, they're rapidly growing. Now, some people will say, yes, but that's to do with reclassification of jobs. That is a labour market mechanism to address youth unemployment. And I'm looking at David here in the front row, so David, please step in if I'm not right. But the fact is that the apprenticeships, and there is a focus on youth engagement and youth training. And when I was with the OECD, I must say, There was a guy called Simon Field who I met who did some research here in Australia a couple of years back and was very much talking to me about the quality of vocational education and training, and he was saying, well, this is really where the future of Australia is. It's got to be about quality. And I was recently, then in Boston with this Professor Schwartz from Harvard talking about the pathways to prosperity. And I'll be honest, he didn't give a very good report card for us. He visits Australia every 2 years. And he said in the last 2 or 3 years, he really felt we're at some sort of turning point. We've had a lot of mucking around in this space. We really were out front for many, many years. But in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of policy changes. There's been a lot of levers that people are reacting and jumping and moving around the space. And although we need to reform and really change the space and move forward, I think we do have to constantly keep our eye on the fact that we need to provide quality education at all costs, right through the entire system. Controversial for some. Why would you want to design an apprenticeship or any skills-based program around employer skills needs? And I'm often asked a question which is really, what is education all about? Surely it's every person's right in a first world educated country to receive a well-rounded education, and an employment outcome is a fantastic result. But there are other fantastic outcomes. The reality is that times are pretty tough. We'd see with what's going on in Greece. I spent some time in Athens 12 months ago. Things are not pretty there. 55, 60% youth unemployment. You walk around the streets, the roller shutters are down. The person who drives you from the airport has a PhD. And you say, well, do you have children? Yes, they've left. They've gone to Germany, they've gone to Austria, they've gone to Switzerland. We really need to keep our eye on the ball about how we are keeping our businesses competitive. And by the way, automotive manufacturing. Does anybody believe that we could actually make cars in this country? Does anyone believe that? I believe we can. I have been to an automotive plant, a $1.1 billion automotive plant in Chattanooga in Tennessee, which is Volkswagen. This plant would have employed 10,000 people traditionally. Today it employs 2,500 people, but it's different types of skills. And they are producing cars for the North American market, as is Volvo, $500 million investment last month. So Mercedes make cars in the US, and people say, well, there's 400 million people. There is no reason that we can't continue on with, some people call it advanced manufacturing. It just needs to be high tech, and we just need to be competitive. And of course, we've got a relatively high labour cost, but we've also got a lot of other things going in our favour. So I believe we can manufacture things in this country. And I do believe, by the way, a bit of a poke at the mining industry, we have not got this right, by the way. We dig up things, put it on ships, and can't wait to get it out of this country. I mean, we need to add value to things along the supply chain here. We have missed a huge opportunity in Western Australia. We should have actually created a hell of a lot more jobs than people just servicing and repairing mining camps. We actually could have created a whole lot of jobs if we set up proper manufacturing supply chains. So I think there's a real opportunity there to recast and relook at that. But yeah, going to employers and saying, what's your skills need? Because the government can pump subsidies into well-meaning programs, and I'm saying that respectfully, all they like. But if the employers are not building these skills-building programs around their skills need, they will fall over, and they do fall over. And is that the best use of money from the public purse? Anyone not pay tax in this room? No? The public purse. We need to say, we pay a bit of tax in this country. I've got to give you the news. That is one of the disgraceful things about America, I must tell you. That is terrible. The CEOs in America pay less tax than the people who work for them, than the doormen in their building and their housekeepers. I mean, what a scam or what a rort that is. So the more money you make, the less tax you pay. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for improvement in the way that the taxes are spent in this country. And we've really got to say, how is that going to make us as a nation competitive in a global economy? And this constant changing cycle of government is of concern. So my advice, if you've got an NGO, your own organisation, is to set your path. Don't chase government funding. You see so many organisations who run around, keep reinventing themselves to chase government funding. We did that. We did that in my organisation for 3 or 4 years. And we would have found ourselves in a situation that, the levers of control, one party comes in, one party goes out, things change, policy changes. You constantly find yourself making people, redundant or outsourcing or leasing offices. You just run around in this circle. So we set a very clear path of where we were going as an organisation. This is in the apprenticeship business, but also in our foundation. And we have now actually attracted like-minded people who actually want to say, well, we like the direction you're going. But it is a bit of a leap of faith, and for some organisations, sadly not reality. But I think we've got to get the funding levers right. I did skip over point 2. I don't want to dwell on point 2. It's fairly obvious. It's a competitive marketplace out there. When I said before we employ 200 apprentices, it's through the group training model. Now, a lot of people in the room may say, but Nick, I thought group training's dead. I thought group training's had its day. I thought the Australian federal government, as of a week ago, stopped funding group training. The reality is that group training is actually an employer-funded model, and the government top-up is only a small percentage of that. It's about 5 to 7%. And that 5 to 7% was actually working with disadvantaged groups and groups on the fringe, and I think that's fairly short-sighted of the government to not want to be involved in supporting those sort of initiatives. But as far as offering attractive pay, I think we also need to get off the conversation with pay, particularly when you're looking at apprenticeships. I talk to a lot of apprentices and say, it's a training wage. It's actually a training wage. So I think we've got to get the balance right. I don't think it's right that welfare with some add-ons is actually higher than first-year apprentice pay. I think that's wrong. I think that sends the wrong message in this country, definitely. But I also think that we need to say to some young people, how cool is this? You can actually earn while you learn. The old cliche, but it is true. It's a different way, and if you look back to America, and there's some great things about America, another thing that's not great about America is student loan debt. Does anyone know how much the student loan debt is in America? $1.2 trillion. My American friends like to shop. With the credit card, they love to shop. The student loan debt is more than credit card debt in America. The average student loan debt is $32,000. People are going into the education systems because there is this college for all mentality. And people are starting to realise, we had a economic, what did we call it? The global financial crisis. We didn't go into recession. Well, the Americans did. And what that did is it really sent a message to middle America, hey, maybe you better future-proof yourself. Maybe you actually better look at what the real jobs are and where the real prospects are. So there's quite an appetite in America for skills programs. The US federal government has just put $100 million on the table to set up apprenticeship programs. $100 million. That's a lot of money. But in years gone by, the total spend that the US federal government spent on apprenticeships in the US was $27 million. That's not a whole lot of money. So they've got a whole lot of area to improve. So that's why I'm having pretty good times in the US. I can write. I've got a column with Huffington Post and with Forbes, and I've got enough material for the next 100 years, which is really talking about not only the labour market mismatch, but the college for all mentality. I don't believe that it's the same in Australia, but I still do believe there is a bias away from skills-based or vocational careers. And I think we really need to address that, and that's not going to be addressed through a television campaign or through, this is going to be a long path because it's actually a cultural thing, because it's going to be driven by generations. So I think we really need to continue on the conversation. I think it started, and I think that we also need to bring the media along. Is there anyone here from the media? Fantastic. Right, I don't want to out you, so I'll come and sit next to you and we'll have a little one-on-one session. I want to change the conversation in the Australian media, you know, and I mean, we've got past, thank goodness. You know, someone comes to take a photo of a young apprentice chef and they want to get the oranges and they say, yeah, juggly oranges, that'd be cool for the, you know, the photo, whatever. It's an apprentice. This is one of our apprentices, not a circus performer, you know. We need to make sure we bring the media along in the conversation and stop these sort of one-hit front page, here today, gone tomorrow. And I think if you look at print media, it really is here today, gone tomorrow. Online media has a longer campaign, but I think we need to find like-minded people, and I know who they are, and we could sort of make a list of people who we can have a sensible conversation and bring along and really start to not just focus on the extremes in either direction, high youth unemployment or this incredible announcement about this skills initiative. I think there's got to be some middle ground and really start to bring into our everyday conversation. These are the types of jobs that exist in our country. These are the types of jobs that may exist. And I think that's really important. Unlikely advice for teenagers. Anyone who has Twitter? Okay, about half the room. Yeah, I like a bit of the old Twitter myself, you know. Sometimes I look around Twitter when I'm sort of sitting at an airport lounge, and I mean, unlikely advice for teenagers. Take lots of selfies of yourself while you're smoking weed and post them to Instagram. Employers love those. The reality is that the online space for young people is an absolute disaster at the moment. Absolute disaster. We get so many young people, back to our experience in Western Sydney, some of the email addresses that these young people show up with are just something special. I could write a book about it. One young man's email address was bong on bin Laden. And I thought to myself, you know, these are the people that, you know, we employ a lot of people around this country. I actually want to come and talk to that person myself. And I'm not saying, I want to relate to them and really say, this is a sort of a career limiting move for you, potentially. And so is gilding the lily. You know, there was another guy who had his CV, and he very proudly, I was looking down through it, and one of his many attributes, he'd completed his first year in horticulture, and he used to mow the synthetic wicket. And, or like the young lady who wanted to get into finance, into a business traineeship, and she got confused between assets and liabilities and said she'd be a huge liability for any employer who took her on. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the damage of Facebook. I'm talking about the damage of Twitter. And I'm talking about, I don't think there's a place or a space, huge business opportunity here, a professional space for young people to talk about their careers. And LinkedIn is not it, by the way. I write for LinkedIn. If I write an article that talks about Donald Trump, sad as it is, and it's usually, when I say I'm talking about Donald Trump, I had a heading which was something like, what human resource managers can learn from Donald Trump. I'm glad no one knows my address. You know, people were throwing things through the window. The fact is, hire apprentices was the message of the story. 50,000 views. If I use the word electrician, and you can go and have a look on my LinkedIn profile, if you use the word electrician, vocational, technical, I get about 2,000 views. People look at, they don't even click on the article, they look at it and say, So what my point is, I think LinkedIn is great. I use it really as a way to keep in contact with people, but I think there needs to be a way that young people, not on Facebook, not on Twitter, not on Snapchat, not on Instagram, I think there's got to be a professional way that young people can come across. Very quickly, people programs and partnerships is what I talk about, and for those who've got a copy of my book, I explain that in there. But these are what I describe as the core elements, and particularly here, we're talking today about partnerships between education providers, and that is the only way forward. It's the only way forward, and the institutions that want to run their own race, there is no future in that. Unless you've got a very, very big bank account or you've got some hefty donors, you actually need to work with people in your community. These are people from my current book, and a couple of Australians in there. The guy, the chef, has actually worked for me for 19 years. We used to be on the tools together. When he was working in TAFE as a commercial cookery teacher, he used to moonlight at my restaurant on a Saturday night, and he now is one of our apprentice program mentors. And Greg's a fantastic guy, And he's able to relate to the apprentices. He's got a teaching background. It is true and genuine mentoring that he provides. And that's why in our mentored apprenticeship programs, we've got completion rates above 87%. Now, the national average for apprenticeships completions is around 50%. I always get so nervous when I mention anything to do with statistics, Craig. I'll look at you to say that's a fairly well-known statistic, that that is something we need to address, because think about the inefficiency in that. Think about the paperwork. The guy in the middle, very quick story and then we're going to wrap up, but the guy in the middle, his name's Doug Gorenstein. He's a New York-based headshot photographer, and he's the photographer. I don't know how I keep talking about Donald Trump. You said, my colleague said, don't mention Donald Trump anymore, Nick, it's bad. Anyway, he is the on-set photographer for The Apprentice, but he's also Jimmy Fallon's photographer, and he talks about he thought he was going to be an actor. He didn't really find what was going to go on in his career, and one day someone handed him a camera, and he's now probably one of the most successful headshot photographers in the world. And so when I was there interviewing him for my book, I said, hey, what about wouldn't mind taking a headshot. So he took a headshot, which was great. And it actually was the headshot that ended up on the back of my book, which was fantastic. But one of the deals with the publisher in the US is that whenever I walk past a bookstore in the US or in the UK, is I go in and sign the books. And then they put a little sticker on the front, autographed. Then it gets moved from the top shelf and goes to the table at the front door. And I went into this Barnes & Noble, for those who know Barnes & Noble, and it was Saturday morning, and I just went in there quickly, didn't have my wallet, went up to the counter, said, hey, yeah, I'm Nick, I've written this book, here they are, I'd like to sign them. And said, look, we're going to have to ask you, Mr Wyman, for some ID. Why? Why? Yeah, well, we've had a space of people pretending to be famous authors, they sign the books, write crazy messages, and, And I said, I don't have my wallet with me, but trying to be, it's me. She looked at it and said, thank God for Photoshop. I mean, I was, Doug did it, took out a few of the greys and gave me a little chin tuck. But the story is that there are some really exciting opportunities and career pathways, and I think we really need to tell those stories. We need to get past we have these mainstream conversations, but I think there's some really new and emerging and interesting occupations, and we need to really profile those. There's 3 programs which I won't talk about in great detail, but interestingly, when you look at those programs, City New Recruits is a program that Skilling Australia Foundation runs, and we're supported through Citibank. So that is what I would describe as a philanthropic-based skills program, and that is really working with people who, for whatever reason, have slipped through the cracks, but it's really a pathway to employment. Now, if we had our labour market mechanisms right, we wouldn't need to have programs like that. The other 2 programs are Mismatch and a program I've set up there, which is, with another large organisation. They are built around the employer skills needs. And the success in those programs is driven by one thing, that it is a top-down led initiative. It is very hard to build these skills programs. Both of these organisations here, I actually work with the CEOs of those companies, and I make sure that the CEO must be involved and continue to be involved in those programs and really own the programs, and that really gives these programs viability and life. So both of these programs employ apprenticeships in several countries. Very quickly in wrapping up, has anybody heard about the government's pilot of PTech, or Pathways in Technology? Okay. So when I was in the US, I actually went on a Churchill Fellowship looking for a fresh approach to engaging young Australians in skilled careers. I actually thought I was going looking for a careers advice model. And what it turned out is I really started to focus on models which were the school to work transition models. And for those this afternoon, David, just want to stand up for a sec? So David has come all the way from the UK, and David's going to talk this afternoon about another very interesting school to work model focused on STEM called University Technical Colleges. And for those interested in this particular slide, I'd recommend attending this session. So the Australian government is going to host a pilot of what we're calling the P-Tech style model. So this is in the US, it's a 9 through 14 model, and it's a different way for students to learn. So when we go back to my experience, it was about how my school was able to pass the message and make the curriculum engaging, which it wasn't. So through this model, it's about strong academics, real-world workplace skills, and there's some attributes of the model. Employers can help craft the curriculum. So in Australia, in the pilot, IBM is going to be involved in one school. There's another 3 or 4 small and medium-sized companies that are getting involved with other schools. The employers are not running the schools. They're not running the schools. They're not setting the curriculum. They're having a hand in. And I think that we need to bring employers along in the conversation and hold them accountable. No use them saying we can't find the people with the skills we need. These employers also have to stump up and offer first in line for jobs, so that's also an important attribute. So really, what can be done to close the skills gap? Well, review curriculum, strengthen literacy and numeracy. I think that constantly develop education and training strategies, and for employers, maintain a long-term commitment to skills. There was an international French-owned 5-star hotel chain, you can work out who that is, who during the GFC let go of their apprentices because they thought they'd just employ them back. And as it turned out, they actually had to close outlets, and that's a true story, because they didn't have the skills they needed to get the job done, and it was a time where there was just not enough skilled people coming through the labour pipeline. And the final point, which I really wanted to wrap up on, is this idea of raising the status of skills. So I think we've talked about that this morning, and that's something that's very near and dear to my heart. So, of course, I talk about having a conversation. Rebecca, have we got time for? I know we've gone we've got 3 minutes. Okay. Are there any? We don't need to even run with a mic. Maybe if you can just shout it. Is there anybody who has a burning question? If not, tweet me, email me. I'd be really interested. As I said, I'm writing a book. I've got 3 weeks to get the manuscript done, and there's an opportunity to include stories or to... I'm open-minded about people saying, Nick, I can categorically prove that what you've said doesn't make sense. Please tell me. So, any questions at all? Any Dorothy Dixes that I lined up earlier? Over here, no?
Thank you very much for your comments. Can you just add some more comments about why you think that the career advice model isn't working?
The career advice? Right. If I'd have to say, in the last 10 years, where I've personally taken the most heat from and the angry emails, it's when I start talking about careers advice. And that's the truth. Careers advisors, actually, when I say careers advice, they say I'm talking about careers advisors. It's hit and miss, and I'm sorry to say, in this country it is hit and miss. Some schools have it under control. Some schools still have a part-time teacher, whatever the case may be. Some state governments have run initiatives, some have not run initiatives. I think that if you look back over the last 25 years in Australia, there's been varying attempts to look at the career advice model, make it more relevant. I think the answer is we just need to integrate it as a part of the overall. It doesn't need to be a standalone silo. It needs to be a part of the partnership and a part of the conversation, and I don't think it needs to be reinvented. I think that careers advice needs to be probably better funded in a lot of areas. I think, talking about where we spend our government money, there's probably time for one more question. Happy to talk to you on the break about that. Up the back.
So what is happening for industry and training bodies to put pressure on governments to increase careers advisors allocations when they may be working on a 0.1 allocation in many schools, a few hours a week, compared to some schools having a full-time careers advisor?
Great point. What is happening, and I think sometimes there's actually too much representation. I don't know in your own organisations. There are so many membership-based organisations that people ask me to become a member of, and I'm not saying picky and choosy, but there's quite often lobby groups that are competing with each other, and they get so focused on the mechanics of what they're actually doing, they actually lose track of what they should be doing. And I think that this school-to-work transition conversation, so maybe it's a reframe with them. Maybe it's the idea of a reframe. Let's talk about, you know, the school to work transition, because if we don't get that right, things are not going to go very well for this country economically. Is that
Nicholas,
about?
I have a question of you, and that is, assume that I'm an employer who's never had an apprentice ever, and I'm
Yes.
a small to medium-sized enterprise, and you're a GTO, and you had a conversation with me, and you say, you've got to take on this young person because. What are the becauses?
Well, I think for the margins are tight. You're a small to medium-sized employer. It's competitive out there. Now, the Minister was here yesterday talking about cutting red tape. That's a good aspiration. And some of the red tape is being cut. But there is a lot of pressure on small businesses, and they actually need to run their businesses. And quite often, they turn away from taking on a young person because they believe that it's actually going to take time they don't have, supervision they don't have, mentoring they don't have. So by using an intermediary, now I'm not saying GTOs are the only option. There are all sorts of other community-based organisations, training institutions that you can actually partner with in your businesses. But having that intermediary takes some of the risk. And from the apprentice's perspective, it gives that person a second chance. Because quite often, an employer, the supervisor and the apprentice might not hit it off. And the employer says to the apprentice, generally not the employer or the owner, it's the supervisor, you're no good at this. Craig, you just don't get what this automotive thing's about. And so Craig might leave and believe that's true, and it's actually not true. What's true is that Craig wasn't able to work with that employer or with that supervisor, but in a GTO model, that person is actually employed by the GTO, comes back to that GTO and then is placed with another employer, and that ultimately is going to address the cancellation rates. But I think also having that, it's really a one-stop shop, that's another opportunity. So it's really trying to make it easier for an employer to take on an entry-level worker. And at the end of that person's training, you, the employer, can actually... Sorry, you were the employer and then I made you the employee. Anyway, I just thought that was a very confused little discussion. But anyway, I think people got the general gist of what's going on. So I think there's a role for intermediary partners. One last question, or I think that's it. I think I'm over time.
Hi, do you have any thoughts on employer expectations not matching what's out there in the workforce? For example, I see traineeship positions advertised with someone who needs the equivalent of what a certificate 3 or 4 person would come in with. So how do we address that difference, I guess?
I'm always talking to the Business Council of Australia saying, can I write an article for you, and this is what it's going to say. You need to tell your members to broaden their horizons about who it is they might want to employ. Employ people from underrepresented groups. Don't employ the best person for the job. You're right, a lot of employers have these blinkers on. They have these terrible pleas. If you hear of an employer who has one of those CV scanning things that can look through resumes and rule people out of jobs, I mean, that's probably the worst invention ever in the history of mankind, you know. People have worked out how to manipulate it. You know, we need to get young people in front of employers, and particularly with entry-level workers, what are you employing on, really? The uncle says that they're a great person in a reference, or mum and dad says my son or daughter's great. You just want the young person to show up. So what we're looking for when we employ is, number one thing is attendance, right? All we want to know is this person, because if they don't show up in the classroom or to work, we can't teach them anything. So we want to see, we actually go through this person's resume and we go to, did they attend some, it might be a sporting thing on the weekends? We ring the coach. Did the person show up? Were they interested? And if they say yes, we give them an opportunity. That's it. You know, we're not looking for some that their father or mother or brother has this really important job and all. So often, employers are looking for the wrong attributes. So with an entry-level worker, and I'm wrapping it up, Craig, for an entry-level worker, you really want to look that the person is interested and going to show up, and then that's what we're all doing. We're in the education space. Let's teach them something. Let's get them engaged. Craig, thank you for the opportunity. And Rebecca, thank you for the opportunity.